about sort of power, privilege, and neutrality in research. It's something that through my master's I was working with Indigenous populations in Canada, and so most of my research was about how do I actually do research with marginalized populations as a researcher, as a white European descendant person who's living in North America. So mostly for 2 years I was sort of delving into this idea of how I'm doing research and how my identity and how power interacts in research and how that affects the populations we're working with, but also the outcome of the research. Why are we talking about it? We're talking about it because we are all researchers here, whether we are part of the community groups specifically that we are asking the questions of, doing interviews with, doing focus groups with, or if we're working with groups even in our own communities that we may not be a part of that group as our identity. There's a few things that we need to look at as researchers, no matter what our role is in the work that we're doing. The sort of traditional way of looking at academic researchers is that it's completely objective. So there's this pure scientific way that we can do research. When we look at a problem, that researchers act as a mirror and perfectly mirror what's going on in the world into that report, into that analysis, into those research outcomes. But what's really going on, there's all sorts of filters going on between the reality in the community and the information that we get out afterwards. So today we're going to look a little bit at all those different filters that are going on in between, which I've called the researcher's lens. So what often happens is there's this community reality. We've got an orange box and a green sun and some pink swirls, and after we've done the research we have this red rain cloud and these green lines and this blue triangle. And how did we get so far away from what's really going on to what our research results are and how we're using those research results? And the more that we get away from the community reality, the less effective we are in the work that we're doing, because the less we are working from what's actually going on and trying to look at policy change and make changes from that, because we're using sort of information that isn't in line with what's really going on. So today I want to look at sort of 3 aspects of how power and privilege can filter that information. The first aspect is you and the identity that you have. So what are your experiences? What are your assumptions? What are your biases? If you're sitting in an interview and somebody starts talking about horses and you've always loved horses, and you're going to really listen to that story and write a lot of notes about it and think that that was a really big thing that came out of that interview. Whereas somebody else sits down and is talking about golfing and you maybe have never gone golfing before. So you're not maybe going to listen as attentively to it or take as much notes or think that that was something that came out of that interview. So the first step is that we as interviewers need to be really aware of who we are and what our experiences are and how that affects how we're hearing people, what we're listening for, and even whose voices that we want to be hearing and whose voices we're maybe not as important. The second aspect is you as a researcher. So as a researcher going into a room and having called people together, asking them questions, having defined the research, you have a lot of power in that situation. So we're doing participatory research and we're doing community-based research, and we're using a lot of tools and tactics in the work that we're doing to try and offset that power balance a little bit, but it's still there. So we need to sort of be aware of that and how we are using that power and not pretend that there isn't a power relationship going on. And the third piece that we're going to look at a little bit is you in sort of the broader society. How is it different for me as a 28-year-old woman to walk into a room and do an interview versus a 60-year-old man to walk into a room and do an interview? How does that affect the dynamic? How does that affect how people are feeling, what stories they might share, what stories they might not share? Our identity, broader than us in the bigger picture of our society, really affects how we're interacting with people and what we're doing there. So the whole point of sort of looking at this and some of the stuff that we're going to do this afternoon is to locate yourself in the research. So an Indigenous and feminist research method is to actually acknowledge that we don't do objective research, that doesn't exist, and to fully, with all your awareness, step into your research and say I. So even when you're writing papers and things in the feminist and Indigenous methodology, you write I, blah, blah, blah. And in the objective research, you always take the I out and you try and pretend like you weren't involved in the research at all. So what I'm sort of getting at here is like, let's step into this research and acknowledge that we are putting up all these filters. And the more that we can acknowledge and understand what those filters are, the more that what's actually happening in the reality of the community can come through into the research results and into the work that we're doing. The more effective we can be in the work that we're doing, the greater sense of community that we can create as we're doing that. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you.